Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Discipleship in a Sexually Confused Culture. It's where we live, and we're going to be figuring out how we can deal with it. Our plan over the next couple sessions is we'll try to start at 10:30 because the class is being live streamed, so that'll be sort of our starting point. So you can kind of think about 10:30 now. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk through a book by Christopher West called Our Bodies Tell God's Story. We're not going to presuppose that you've actually read the book, but if you'd like to, you're certainly welcome. They've got copies down in the bookstore. You can get one on Amazon. Either way is fine. So what I want to do this morning is I want to kind of walk us through the first chapter. Say a little bit about the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s, some of its consequences, and then some of the basic themes of the theology of the body, which is what we'll be kind of working with for the next 7 weeks or so. We'll be coming back to all these themes in one way or another. So this is sort of like a giant trailer to get you to come back, okay? Like they do in the movies. So let's think for a minute about how the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s changed the world. And it's really important to remember that we don't want to think about the sexual revolution as something that sort of is like out there happening among those people, and here we are in the church and it doesn't really affect us at all. Example, a recent issue of Christianity Today reported on a growing phenomena that pastors of evangelical Protestant churches are now having to deal with at an increasing level. Couples living together before they get married in the church. So here's one sign of how the sexual revolution literally has changed our world. Even among evangelical Protestant Christians, living together before marriage is now thought of as being somewhat normal. That's a sign of how much our world has changed. Now, lots of books have been written on the sexual revolution. We don't have time to go through it. I want to summarize it by making 2 points. So I want to say a little bit about how the sexual revolution has changed how we think about sex in 2 fundamental ways. Way number 1, Christianity thinks about sex teleologically or purposively. Okay, so Christianity has historically thought about sex in terms of its purpose. Why did God create it? And generally throughout the church's history, there have been 2 reasons that have been given. Reason number 1, sex is the physical sign of the emotional and spiritual bond between husband and wife in marriage. Notice point number 1, right? In the Christian way of thinking about things, sex and marriage are inseparable. The sexual relationship between husband and wife is actually one of the signs of their marriage. Important point. The sexual revolution changed all that by thinking about sex in a fundamentally non-purposive way, or in a purposive way that is very much lessened. So what happens during the sexual revolution is sex is now thought of no longer in terms of marriage or procreation. It's now thought of simply as a kind of momentary thrill. Notice what happens. As a result of the sexual revolution now, sex, marriage, and procreation have now all been pulled apart. They are no longer connected in the minds of many people. Okay? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Christianity has typically thought about sex holistically. That is, Christianity has thought about sex as a dimension of our personhood. Okay, we'll talk more about this later. But Christianity has typically thought about sex as being one dimension of who we are as human beings. And therefore, Because that's the case, moral and spiritual norms apply to sex because improper sexual desire or improper sexual activity, guess, does what? It hurts our souls. Improper sexual desire, improper sexual activity actually has the effect of harming our souls, harming us as people made in God's image. The sexual revolution changed all that by, in effect, reducing sex to biology. It also kind of reduced human beings to biology as well. I'll say more about that in just a minute. And this has had a sort of an odd effect. So now, for Christianity, sex is a dimension of our personhood. Now, what's happened is that actually sex is our personhood. And that's why we have all kinds of people now who will identify themselves by their sexual orientation. Okay? I am homosexual, I am a lesbian, I am bisexual, I am transsexual, I am on and on. Now, right, sexuality becomes an inherent part of someone's identity. Okay? So that's a huge change. The point that I want to make here very briefly is just simply this. So long as we think about sex in the terms set by the sexual revolution, we will not think about it in a Christian way. Okay? If you set out thinking about sex within the sort of boundary markers of the sexual revolution, you will not be thinking about it in a Christian way no matter how hard you try. No matter how good you are, no matter how earnest your heart is, you won't get there. It won't happen. Okay? So that's a way of getting started. So let's think about what a response to the sexual revolution might look like. That is, how do we begin to think about sex and our bodies in a Christian way as opposed to a non-Christian way? So one of the things we want to remind ourselves of is that the sexual revolution poses an enormous challenge to the church in at least two ways. There are a whole bunch of ways. Let me just highlight two. Way number one, a lot of folks who, in effect, adopted the way of thinking about sex that we've gotten from the sexual revolution have ceased to be Christians. You can see how this would work, right? Oh, the purpose of sex is momentary pleasure. It's about having a great time. It has nothing to do with commitment. It has nothing to do with marriage. It has nothing to do with procreation of children. It's about having a good time. And then they move from that right to gradually kind of drifting off into unbelief. So there's one consequence right there. Another consequence is many church leaders found themselves taken sort of by surprise by the sexual revolution, okay? And so on one hand, right, the sexual revolution was promising, liberation and freedom and happiness. And in effect, church leaders were caught off guard and basically were left doing one of two things. They were left talking about rules, that's wrong, that's against the rules, or they lapsed into silence. Neither one is very helpful. Where a lot of churches are right now today is they're in silence. We realize there's something wrong, but you know what? We're just not going to say anything about it. Too controversial. It'll rile people up. Let's pretend that everything's all right, and we'll move on from there. So in the 1950s, a young Polish Catholic priest who also happened to have a PhD in philosophy sort of saw this coming and decided that what needed to happen was that the church needed to be able to talk about human sexuality in a kind of a fresh and vibrant way. The young priest's name was Karol Wojtyła in Poland. And he began with a fundamental assumption, and if you don't remember anything I say this morning, please remember this. He began with a fundamental assumption, and that's this. The problem with the sexual revolution was not that it thought of sex too highly, but that it didn't think of sex highly enough. The problem with the sexual revolution wasn't that it thought about sex too highly, but that it didn't think about it highly enough. And here was his reasoning. Father Wojtyła reasoned that God's design for human sexuality was far more beautiful, far more glorious, and far more freedom-producing than anything the sexual revolution could ever come up with. He also realized, right, the sexual revolution actually was a highway into a kind of bondage. So what the sexual revolution has told us is, you know what? All your sexual desires are right. Follow them. And guess where that's led? It's led to 3 immense changes in American culture. And I think you could summarize those changes like this. Now, divorce, pornography, and abortion are industries in this country. Divorce, pornography, and abortion are carried on in this country at an industrial level. So much for freedom. So Father Wojtyła decided to begin working this vision out amongst couples that he worked with. He did all kinds of marriage retreats for engaged couples. He was also working as a campus chaplain, and so he worked it out there. He was also serving as a university professor at different points, and so he tried. And then he continued to try it out when he was appointed to be Archbishop of Krakow in Poland. Now, you may have not have heard of Karol Wojtyła by that name, but you've probably heard about him under his other name, because in 1978 he became Pope John Paul II. And this is his vision. The theology of the body is essentially his vision. And so what he does in this book called The Theology of the Body is he goes from Genesis to Revelation as a way of thinking about what kind of guidance and insight Scripture provides us with regard to God's design for human sexuality and the body. And that's what we'll be walking through over the next couple weeks. But he begins with a really important premise, and that's this: that because human sexuality is deeply rooted in God's plan and purpose for us, there's a very real sense in which human sexuality is, as he says, a profound mystery, which must be treated as such. Human sexuality is a profound mystery because it's deeply rooted in God's design for us as human beings. Or to say that in another way, a superficial understanding of sex will lead to a superficial understanding of who we are as human beings. If you understand sex simply as a bundle of biological desires, you're going to end up with a very, very flawed and superficial understanding of what a human being is. If you begin with the assumption that human beings are creatures made in the image of God, and that sex somehow has a role in God's overall plan, you're going to arrive at a very different understanding of what people are. So let's take a look at some of the kind of the basic ideas of the theology of the body. And I want to begin with Ephesians 5, 22 to 33. I'm not going to read it because we're kind of challenged for time. But in Ephesians 5, 22 to 23, this is Paul's great meditation on marriage. It's actually one of the epistle lessons in the marriage liturgy in the Book of Common Prayer. This is the famous context where, remember, Paul says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her," right? And then Paul goes on to say that the relationship between husband and wife is a sign of Christ's relationship to the church. And this is where Paul concludes by saying, this is a great mystery, Paul says. Okay, so the idea here is, and this is kind of the beginning point of the theology of the body, is that marriage and sex have a really important role in God's plan. That is, the relationship that husband and wife have to one another, which is a self-sacrificial relationship of spiritual, emotional, and physical intimacy, that marriage, in effect, gives us a visible sign of the kind of love that Christ has for the church, and also the kind of relationship that God calls us to with Him. Okay? The intimacy and the fidelity in marriage are a sign of the intimacy and fidelity that God calls us to. So here's the point. If we don't get this right, if we have a superficial understanding of marriage, and if we have a superficial understanding of human sexuality, guess what? We're not going to really understand the kind of relationship that God calls us to. That is, in effect, right, the way that we understand sex and marriage has a direct bearing on our understanding of who we are as God's people. So this is like really, really important, right? We can't get this wrong. So I think we could say that the theology of the body can be summarized in kind of one sentence. And let me do that here. I'm kind of going out on a ledge, trying to summarize this in one sentence, okay? So here it is. If you and I are made in the image of God, which Genesis 1:27 says that we are, and if the union of husband and wife in marriage refers to the relationship between Christ and the church, which Ephesians 5:32 says that it does, then how we understand the human body, gender, and sexuality will have an enormous impact on how we understand God and our life in Christ. There's a fundamental and profound connection between those things. So once again, this is really, really important. Or to put that in a slightly different way, it's important that we need to think through the fact, right? If God created marriage, and if God created human sexuality as a way of telling us something about the kind of relationship that He wants to have with us, if we misunderstand those two things, we're going to be really missing something. There will be like a fundamental error in our lives as Christians. So one of the fundamental presuppositions of the theology of the body is this. And this may sound kind of odd, but for some folks, this is going to come as a revelation. Sex is not just about sex. Sex is not just about sex. It has to do with our understanding of the meaning of life. It has to do with who we understand God to be, and it also has to do with who we are in Christ. Sex is not just simply about sex. It's about a lot more than that. One of the fundamental biblical texts of the theology of the body is John 15:12, where Jesus says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." Notice the commandment. This is often forgotten, right? Jesus isn't saying, okay, love one another. I want you to get out there and I want you to all have like a warm feeling in your heart for one another, okay? Pull up your list of email recipients and send every one of them a Valentine's Day card. No. Love one another as I have loved you. Well, how has Jesus loved us? Self-sacrificially, right? That's the kind of love that God is interested in bringing about in us. Now, let me say a few words about, we call it anthropology, an understanding of human nature. So let me say a few words about this. How we understand human nature and who we understand people to be is really important, okay? Today, we have, in many ways, a lot of people operate with a very kind of reductionistic understanding of human beings. And one of my favorite ways of of talking about that very reduced understanding of human beings is we have lots of people today who are fundamentally materialist, right? The material world is the final reality, and therefore you and I as human beings are, and here's the phrase, you and I are simply bags of chemicals. Have you ever thought of yourself as a bag of chemicals? Okay. That's the fundamental anthropology in many ways that's out there. Okay? You and I are random products of an evolutionary process, and when it all comes down to it, right, we are simply fairly complex bags of chemicals, and that's about the end of the story. Okay? Therefore, right, what we need to do is we need to think about, well, what's the right way to understand people? Okay? If sex is a dimension of our person, well, who are we? So let me say a brief word about that. We'll be coming back to it. One of my favorite lines in Mere Christianity is C.S. Lewis warns us, right, against developing an overly spiritualized Christianity. And he reminds us, right, he says, you know what? God likes matter. He invented it. Right? The material world is like not bad for the simple reason that God created it, okay? Now that has a lot to say with how we as Christians should think about ourselves. And one of the ways that we shouldn't think about ourselves is this. We should not think of ourselves as somehow, you know what, we're souls that are like trapped in these awful bodies. That's actually not a Christian way of thinking. That comes from a form of philosophy that's called Neoplatonism. Okay, for the Neoplatonists, we're like lovely, wonderful souls that are like stuck in these awful, icky, decaying, smelly, disease-ridden bodies. And our goal is to get out of them as soon as we can. Okay, that's actually not a Christian way of thinking. As Christians, we think about ourselves in a very different way. So, once again, this is a really complex thought, so let's kind of chew it over for a while. Christianity says that you and I are incarnate souls. We are souls that have bodies by God's intention because the body is the means that the soul expresses itself in. Okay? Our bodies are the means by which our souls realize themselves and express themselves in the world. Okay, so the body is like really, really important. Okay? We relate to other people through the body. We relate to God through the body because, of course, He gave bodies to us, right? You relate to God through your body at least one time every week, and that's when you go up to that altar and hold out your hands, right? You are relating to God bodily because you are being handed Christ's body and you're receiving Christ's body into your body. Okay, so this is really, really, really important. In the Christian way of thinking, right, therefore, our goal is not to escape the body, to flee from it, but rather we believe in a thing called the resurrection of the body. We believe that God will take our mortal bodies and He will transform them and glorify them. Okay? And therefore, we need to think about our bodies in that sense. Okay? Our bodies are immensely significant. Now, another one of the great biblical passages for the theology of the body is 1 Corinthians 6:15 in the 19th through 20th. Let me read it to you, and I think you'll see its point. So, this is Paul talking to the Corinthians, and the people in Corinth, right, have an essentially pagan understanding of the body. In their minds, right, the body's worthless. What you do with it doesn't matter. And so Paul actually has members of his church in Corinth going and visiting houses of prostitution and saying, you know what? It doesn't matter because it's just your body that's being related to the prostitute. Your soul remains pure. Sounds like an interesting way of thinking, doesn't it? I hope that none of you shares that way of thinking, okay? If you do, we can talk later. But here's what Paul tells them. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God. You are not your own, for you are bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. Glorify God in your body. Your body is a gift to you from God. Your body is sort of like the temple in Jerusalem, a place where God dwells, and therefore it needs to be honored as such. So really, really important way of thinking. Here's another way to think about this. Here's another way to think about the importance that God attaches to the body. So think about it this way. How does God's ultimate revelation of himself come to us? In the person of Jesus, right? Jesus is God's ultimate revelation to us. Well, how does that take place? Well, the Gospel of John in the first chapter puts it this way. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. What does it say to us? That God's ultimate revelation of himself comes through the medium of a human body, the body of his Son, Jesus Christ, the incarnate Word. Another important passage for the theology of the body, 1 John 1, 1 through 2. Now once again, the letter of John was written against a sort of growing form of thinking in the early church that said, no, bodies are bad, physical world bad. Jesus actually didn't become incarnate. He only looked human, but he never actually was. Okay? Jesus was sort of like a purely spiritual being, and whatever sort of physicality was sort of like a Halloween costume that he put on and he took off. John says, no, and he says this to them. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and which we have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. John says, look, I'm here to bear witness to the Word made flesh, whom I have seen with my own eyes and whom I have touched with my own hands. This is how God's ultimate revelation has come to us. Okay? So the body is really, really important. And we'll be exploring that theme as well. So let me say a few more things about the premises of the theology of the body, and then I'm going to say some few things about the Bible, and then we'll be done for the day. Now, over the course of human history, there have been basically sort of two views of the human body. Okay, over time, people have taken basically one of these two views or nuances thereof. So, view number one: the body is essentially worthless. It's a bag of chemicals that we're all going to just leave behind, okay? It's awful, it's bad, the goal is to get away from it. What you do in it has no moral significance whatsoever, because you're going to leave it behind. That's one view. Second view is the body is sort of like something that we worship, and we can sort of think about all the ways we worship the body today, okay? Plastic surgery, so all these kind of ways that we figured out, right, to sort of make ourselves better. Give hair back to those who've lost it. Get rid of the bags under your eyes. Get rid of the sagging stomach. All that kind of thing, right? We kind of are in the mode now of worshiping the body. Christianity agrees with neither one. It says that the body is a creation of God, but this is really important. In Genesis 1, 27 to 28, we're told God made human beings, male and female, in his own image, which means that our bodies are signs. The human body is a sign which points in some way to God. Okay, really, really important thing. And the same is true with our sexuality. Our bodies and our sexuality, right, in some ways point to God. They're signs which point to God. The problem is, and we'll deal with this later on, the problem is that sin has warped our perception of all this, and in some cases, blinded us to it. Okay? Sin has actually warped our perception of our bodies, warped our perception of sexuality, and in some cases, blinded us to their deeper meaning. Okay? Let me give you an example that illustrates this. So, under sin, right, we can fail to see what our bodies are really about, what our sexuality is really about. A number of years ago, when my son was, I think, 5 or 6, we took him on what I call a child improvement vacation. You know, where you take your children to cultural places to improve their minds, and it does no good. So we took him to Washington, D.C., and we were going, and so we went to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and there was an exhibit that Sarah wanted to see, so she went off by herself. I was left with Graham, and so I was taking him around, and we were looking at different things, and all of a sudden, he said in a really loud voice, he said, "Daddy, there's nothing but pictures in here." Well, that's true. This was a building where there was only pictures, right? Do you see the point? He was unable to see the meaning of the pictures. He wasn't able to see their significance. And that's what sin does to our perception of our own bodies and our sexuality. It blinds us to its real meaning. So our bodies, sexuality, are signs which point to God. They have an inherent beauty and inherent meaning that we don't want to deny or to look over. One final point, and we'll be going through this as well. It's really important to remember that in many ways the Bible is a marriage story. It begins, of course, in Genesis, right, with a story about a marriage between a man and a woman in the Garden of Eden, right? That's where the story starts. And it ends with a marriage in Revelation 19, the marriage of Christ to the church. Okay, so begins with a marriage, ends with a marriage. And there's also some strong marital imagery in between. I want to read one of those to you because it's so lovely. It comes from the 62nd chapter of Isaiah. And Isaiah is talking to the people of Jerusalem after Jerusalem has been completely annihilated by a Babylonian army. Jerusalem is in utter ruins. And this is what Isaiah says to those who are still there. "For Zion's sake, I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake, I will not be quiet, until her righteousness goes forth as brightness, and her salvation as a burning torch. The nations shall see your righteousness, and kings your glory, and you shall be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will give. You shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, a royal diadem in the hand of your God. You shall no more be termed forsaken, and your land shall no more be termed desolate, but you shall be called, my delight is in her." That's a name. "And your land married," capital M. "For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your sons marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so your God shall rejoice over you." Notice God's describing his relationship to his people in sort of this fundamental sort of marital imagery, okay? And so the point that we just want to think about here as we close and as we think about the Bible as sort of like a story about marriage, right, is, once again, to the degree that we fail to see the beauty and the mystery and the depth of the human body and the human sexuality, we are going to fail to understand the kind of relationship that God calls us to enter into with him. Needless to say, right, that one of the things that enters into all this is spiritual warfare. If God has designed the body and human sexuality to be pointers to himself, guess who has a vested interest in making sure that none of that is ever noticed? The evil one. The work of the evil one is to distort, degrade, and confuse on these two issues. And the signs of all that, of course, are all around us. So what we need to do is we need to shine a light into the darkness. More next week.